You know that feeling when someone you've lived with for months suddenly feels like a complete stranger? Maybe they laugh differently at your jokes, or they've started humming songs you've never heard them hum before. We tell ourselves people change. New semester, new job, new medication. But what happens when the change isn't gradual? What happens when one person goes to sleep and they wake up as someone else entirely? Tonight, we're exploring 3 stories about roommates who transformed overnight. From college dorms to graduate housing to urban apartments, these are tales of people who thought they knew the person sleeping in the next room. They'd shared meals, complained about rent, argued over whose turn it was to buy toilet paper. But after one night, one trip, one hospital stay, one winter break, everything changed. Because here's the thing about living with someone. You learn their patterns, their quirks, the way they move through space. So when those patterns shift, when familiar becomes foreign, you notice. The question is, do you trust what you're seeing? Or do you trust the face that's been sharing your living space all along? Grab your spare key, because after tonight, you might find yourself listening a little more carefully to what your roommate does when they think you're asleep. The winter replacement. I want to start by saying I'm not the kind of person who believes in conspiracy theories or weird supernatural stuff. I'm a pretty practical guy. I study engineering at Central Michigan University, I work part-time at a GameStop in Mount Pleasant, and my biggest concerns are usually whether I can afford textbooks and if I'm going to pass thermodynamics. But what happened with my roommate Jake during the winter semester of 2020 still keeps me up at night, and I've never been able to find a rational explanation for it. Jake and I had been roommates since freshman year. We got paired up randomly through the housing system, and it worked out pretty well. He was from some small town near Traverse City, Kingsley, I think, and he was studying business with a focus on accounting. Super quiet guy, really methodical about everything. He'd wake up at exactly 6:30 every morning, make instant oatmeal with the same packets of brown sugar, and be at his desk studying by 7 a.m. He kept his textbooks arranged alphabetically, wrote all his assignments in the same blue Pilot G2 pens, and had this weird habit of tapping his pencil exactly 3 times before he started writing anything. We weren't best friends or anything, but we got along fine. Jake would occasionally ask to borrow my phone charger or split the cost of a pizza, but mostly we just coexisted peacefully in our shared space in Towers Hall. He talked to his mom every Sunday at 2 p.m. I could set my watch by it, and he'd always order the same thing when we went to the dining hall. Chicken tenders, mashed potatoes, and green beans. No variation, ever. The thing about Jake that always stuck with me was how he dealt with stress. During finals week, or when he had a big accounting project due, he'd get this nervous tic where he'd pick at the skin around his fingernails until they bled. I'd find little bits of tissue paper in the trash where he'd wrapped up his fingers. He was also terrified of public speaking, like genuinely phobic. I remember him having a panic attack before a presentation in his business communications class. He sat on his bed, hyperventilating for 20 minutes, while I tried to talk him through some breathing exercises I'd learned in high school track. When we left for winter break in December 2019, Jake seemed normal, maybe a little stressed about his intermediate accounting final, but nothing unusual. He was going home to help his dad with some kind of construction project. They were renovating their basement or something. He mentioned it because he was worried about missing gym time and losing the 15 pounds he'd been trying to shed since September. I went home to Dearborn, worked at my uncle's auto shop for 3 weeks, and mostly hung out with my high school buddies. Standard winter break stuff. I remember being kind of excited to get back to school because I'd been dating this girl, Melissa, since October, and we'd been texting constantly over break. When I got back to campus on January 15th, Jake was already there. I walked into our room around 4 p.m., and he was sitting at his desk like always. But the first thing I noticed was that he'd lost weight. A lot of weight. Like noticeably more than the 15 pounds he'd been aiming for. His face looked drawn, and his clothes were hanging loose on him. "Hey man," I said, dropping my duffel bag. "How was break?" "Good," he said, turning around. "Really good. Did a lot of physical work with my dad. Lost some weight." The voice was Jake's voice, but something about the way he said it felt off. Jake had never described anything as really good in the 2 years I'd known him. His usual response to, "How was your break?" would have been something like, "Fine," or "Okay, I guess." But I figured maybe the weight loss had boosted his confidence or something. People change over breaks, right? Over the next few days, though, I started noticing other things. Jake's morning routine was different. Instead of 6:30, he was getting up at 6:45. Instead of brown sugar packets, he was using honey in his oatmeal. Small changes, but for someone as rigidly habitual as Jake, it was like watching a completely different person. The bigger changes became apparent over the next couple of weeks. Jake started going to parties. Jake, who'd never been to a single social event in 2 years of college, suddenly knew about keggers in the dorms and was asking if I wanted to come along. He struck up conversations with people in the hallway, joined study groups, even signed up for intramural basketball. "Dude, what's gotten into you?" I asked him one night after he came back from some party on the 4th floor. It was a Thursday, and the old Jake would never have gone out on a school night. "I don't know," he said, grinning. "I guess I just decided to put myself out there more. My dad and I talked a lot over break about making changes." That made sense, I supposed. Fathers and sons having heart-to-heart conversations during home improvement projects is basically a cliché, but Jake had never mentioned having that kind of relationship with his dad before. When he talked about home, it was usually complaints about his parents being too controlling or boring. The thing that really started to bother me was the nail biting, or rather, the complete absence of it. Jake's fingernails, which had been chronically chewed down to the quick for as long as I'd known him, were suddenly perfectly manicured. Not professionally done or anything, but clean even, like he'd stopped biting them months ago instead of weeks. I mentioned this to Melissa when she came over to study one evening in early February. "Maybe he's just growing up," she said, highlighting something in her psychology textbook. People mature a lot between freshman and sophomore year. But as we were talking, Jake came back from class, and I watched Melissa's face change when she saw him. She'd met Jake several times before, and he'd always been polite but awkward around her. The kind of guy who'd mumble hello and then find an excuse to leave the room. This time, he walked right up to her, smiled, and asked about her major. After he left for dinner, Melissa turned to me with this confused expression. Was Jake always that confident? "No," I said, "that's what I've been trying to tell you." She was quiet for a minute, then said, "It's probably nothing. But when he was talking to me, something felt weird. Like he was performing being friendly instead of actually being friendly. You know?" I knew exactly what she meant. The next incident happened during a snowstorm in late February. Classes were canceled, and most people were staying inside playing video games or catching up on homework. I was in our room working on a mechanical engineering problem set when Jake came back from wherever he'd been. He'd started leaving the room for hours at a time without saying where he was going. He sat down at his desk and pulled out his accounting textbook, but instead of his usual careful, methodical approach to studying, he just stared at the page, not reading, not taking notes, just staring. I glanced over a few times, thinking maybe he was deep in thought about a particularly difficult concept, but his eyes weren't moving. He was literally just staring at the same page for over an hour. "You okay?" I finally asked. He looked up, and for just a second, his face was completely blank. No recognition, no emotion, nothing. Then he smiled and said, "Yeah, sorry. Just thinking through this balance sheet problem." But I could see the page he was looking at. It was the table of contents. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I started to drift off, I'd become hyper-aware of Jake's presence across the room. It wasn't that he was making noise. If anything, he was too quiet. No shifting positions, no coughing, no normal sleep sounds, just absolute silence from his side of the room. Around 3 a.m., I opened my eyes and looked over. Jake was sitting up in bed, perfectly upright, staring straight ahead at the wall. His hands were folded in his lap, and he was so still he could have been a statue. I watched him for maybe 10 minutes, and he didn't move a muscle. No scratching, no adjusting his position, no normal human fidgeting. Nothing. "Jake?" I whispered. No response. I said his name a little louder, and suddenly he turned his head toward me with this smooth mechanical motion that made my skin crawl. "Sorry? Did I wake you?" he said. "I was just thinking." "It's 3 a.m. Yeah, I couldn't sleep. You know how it is. But I didn't know how it was because Jake had never had trouble sleeping. In 2 years of living together, I'd never once seen him have insomnia. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I called Jake's mom. I found her number in his phone when he left it on his desk to go shower. I know it was a violation of privacy, but I was genuinely worried about him. "Mrs. Henderson, this is Mike, Jake's roommate." "Oh, hi Mike. How are you doing? How's school going?" "Good, thanks. I was just calling because I wanted to ask about Jake's break. He seems different since he came back." There was a pause on the other end. "Different how?" "More social, I guess. And he lost a lot of weight. He mentioned doing construction work with his dad." Another pause, longer this time. "Mike, I think there might be some confusion. Jake didn't come home for winter break." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "He called us on December 18th and said he was staying on campus to work on some extra credit projects. We were disappointed, but he seemed determined. We haven't seen him since Thanksgiving." I felt like the room was spinning. "Are you sure? He told me he was going home to work on your basement renovation." "We don't have a basement, honey. We live in a ranch house." After I hung up, I sat on my bed trying to process what I'd just learned. Jake had lied about going home for winter break, but if he hadn't gone home, where had he been for 3 weeks? And why would he lie about it? I started paying closer attention to everything Jake did. His eating habits, his study patterns, the way he interacted with other people. The more I watched, the more convinced I became that something was fundamentally wrong. For one thing, he'd stopped doing his laundry the way he used to. Jake had always been meticulous about washing his clothes every Sunday morning at exactly 9 a.m. He'd sort everything by color, use the same amount of detergent every time, and fold everything according to some system he'd learned from his mom. Now his laundry routine was completely random. Sometimes Tuesday, sometimes Thursday, sometimes not at all, until he ran out of clean clothes. He also stopped calling his mom on Sundays. When I asked about it, he said they decided to talk less frequently to help him become more independent. But that didn't sound like the Jake I knew, who'd been homesick for most of freshman year. The breaking point came in mid-March. I was coming back from Melissa's dorm around 11 p.m. when I saw Jake in the hallway talking to Sarah Morrison from across the hall. Sarah was a pretty blonde girl who'd been friendly but distant with both of us for the past 2 years. Jake had always been too nervous to do more than nod hello when he saw her. But now he was leaning against the wall, casual as anything, making her laugh with some story he was telling. She was actually touching his arm and giggling like they were old friends. When I got to our room, Jake followed me in a few minutes later. "Sarah seems nice," I said, testing the waters. "Yeah, we've been talking more lately," he said. "She's actually really cool once you get to know her." "When did you start getting to know her?" He looked confused for a second, like he was trying to remember. "I don't know. Recently, I guess. But here's the thing. I'd lived across the hall from Sarah for 2 years, and I'd never seen her and Jake have a conversation longer than 30 seconds. There was no recently when they could have gotten to know each other. That night, I pretended to be asleep and watched Jake through half-closed eyes. Around 2 a.m., he got up and quietly left the room. I waited a few minutes, then followed him. He took the stairs down to the basement level, which was mostly storage rooms and mechanical equipment. I stayed far enough behind that he wouldn't see me, but close enough to keep track of where he was going. He stopped outside a storage room at the end of the hall and knocked on the door in a specific pattern. 3 short knocks, pause, 2 long knocks, pause, 3 short knocks again. The door opened, and I saw Sarah Morrison standing there. Behind her, I could make out at least 3 other people I recognized from our floor. They were all standing perfectly still, just like I'd seen Jake do that night in our room. Jake went inside, and the door closed behind him. I crept closer and pressed my ear to the door, but I couldn't hear anything. No talking, no movement, nothing. I waited there for almost an hour before I heard footsteps coming back up the stairs. I ran back to our room and pretended to be asleep, but my heart was pounding so hard I was sure Jake would notice. The next morning, I cornered Sarah in the dining hall. "Hey Sarah, I saw you talking to Jake last night. You guys have become pretty good friends, huh?" She looked at me with this blank expression for a few seconds, then smiled. "Jake's great. We have a lot in common." "Like what?" Another pause, like she was buffering. "You know, just things." I pressed her for specifics, but everything she said was vague and generic. It was like talking to someone who was reading from a script they hadn't quite memorized. That afternoon, I called my parents and told them I was having roommate problems and wanted to switch rooms. My mom asked what kind of problems, and I didn't know what to say. How do you explain that your roommate has been replaced by someone who looks exactly like him, but doesn't know basic facts about his own life? Instead, I told her Jake had started bringing people over at all hours and I couldn't study. She said she'd call the housing office. It took 2 weeks to arrange the transfer, and those were the longest 2 weeks of my life. Jake seemed to sense that something had changed between us, and he started watching me with this intensity that made my skin crawl. Not obviously, he'd still make normal conversation and act friendly, but I'd catch him staring at me when he thought I wasn't looking. One night, I woke up to find him standing next to my bed, just looking down at me. When I sat up, startled, he said he'd been trying to wake me up because I was having a nightmare and making noise. But I hadn't been having a nightmare. I'd been sleeping peacefully until I sensed someone standing over me. "You've been acting weird lately," he said, sitting on the edge of his bed. "Is everything okay?" "I'm fine," I said, but my voice came out shaky. "You sure? Because you seem kind of paranoid about things, like you don't trust me or something." The way he said it, calm, rational, concerned, made me doubt myself for a second. Was I being paranoid? Was I imagining things that weren't there? But then I remembered his mom's voice on the phone, telling me Jake hadn't come home for winter break. That wasn't something I could have imagined. "I'm just stressed about classes," I said. "Okay," he said, but he kept watching me with those intense, unblinking eyes. "But you know you can talk to me about anything, right? We're roommates. We're supposed to look out for each other." I moved out the following week. I told Jake it was because I needed a quieter environment to study for my engineering courses, and he seemed to accept that explanation. He even helped me carry my stuff to the new room in Campbell Hall. "Stay in touch," he said as I was leaving. "Don't be a stranger." But I wanted to be a stranger. I wanted to get as far away from whatever Jake had become as possible. I tried to forget about the whole thing and focus on my classes and my relationship with Melissa. But a few weeks later, I heard through the campus gossip network that Jake had started dating Sarah Morrison. They were apparently inseparable, always together, finishing each other's sentences like they'd known each other for years instead of weeks. I also heard that several other students had requested room transfers that semester, all citing similar vague concerns about their roommates' behavior. When I asked around discreetly, I found out that most of these roommates had also claimed to go home for winter break, but had actually stayed on campus. I graduated last spring and moved to Detroit for a job with Ford Motor Company. I thought I'd left all that weirdness behind in college. But last month, I got a friend request on Facebook from Jake Henderson. His profile looked normal. Pictures of him and Sarah, posts about starting his career in accounting, typical post-college stuff. But something about the photos bothered me. Jake was smiling in all of them, but the smile never reached his eyes. It was like looking at a mannequin wearing Jake's face. I didn't accept the friend request. Instead, I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I drove back to Mount Pleasant and asked around about Jake. I went to some of our old hangout spots, talked to a few people who'd known him. What I found out made my blood run cold. According to the registrar's office, Jake Henderson had withdrawn from Central Michigan University in December 2019. No forwarding address, no explanation, just a sudden withdrawal right before winter break. But the person living in his room dating his girlfriend and using his name, had continued taking his classes and maintaining his GPA through graduation. I don't know what happened to the real Jake Henderson. I don't know who or what took his place. All I know is that sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I think about that basement storage room and wonder how many other people are walking around wearing faces that don't belong to them. I've started paying more attention to the people around me, looking for those telltale signs, the too perfect posture, the unblinking stares, the responses that sound like they're being read from a script. You'd be surprised how many people fail that test. Last week, my new neighbor in Detroit introduced himself. Nice guy, very friendly, said he'd just graduated from college and was starting a job in the automotive industry. We talked for a few minutes about work and the city, normal neighborly conversation. But when I asked him where he went to school, he paused for just a second too long before answering. Central Michigan, he said with that same artificial smile I'd learned to recognize. Go Chippewas. I've been keeping my door locked ever since. After the hospital. Hey everyone, I wanted to share something that came in through our submission email just yesterday. This one hit me pretty hard because it deals with something we all take for granted, trusting the people closest to us. The person who sent this asked me to change their name, so we'll call them Maya. Here's what they wrote. I need to tell someone about what happened to my roommate Jess last month, because I'm starting to think I'm losing my mind. Every time I try to explain it to people, they look at me like I've been watching too many horror movies or spending too much time alone. But I know what I saw, and I know what happened in our apartment. Let me start from the beginning. I'm a graduate student at Ridgemont University, working on my master's in environmental science. I've been living in this cramped 2-bedroom apartment about 3 miles off campus with my roommate Jess for almost 2 years now. She's getting her PhD in biochemistry, and we met through the university's roommate matching service. We clicked immediately. Both of us are night owls who survive on coffee and ramen, both obsessed with our research and both too broke to afford living alone. Jess has always been one of those naturally healthy people who never get sick. She runs 5 miles every morning at exactly 6 a.m., meal preps every Sunday with these elaborate salad combinations, and drinks this awful green smoothie that smells like lawn clippings. I've always been a little jealous of her discipline, to be honest. While I'm struggling to remember to eat actual meals between research sessions, she's got her whole life mapped out with color-coded calendars and vitamin schedules. Our apartment is in one of those converted houses that landlords split up to squeeze more rent out of college students. The walls are thin enough that I can hear Jess's alarm clock through them, and the heating system makes these random clanking sounds that took me months to get used to. There's a small medical research facility about half a mile down the road, Ridgemont Medical Associates, where a lot of the graduate students do internships or part-time work. Jess had done some lab work there during her second year, though she always said the hours were terrible and the pay wasn't worth it. It was a Tuesday in early October when everything started. I remember because I just submitted a draft of my thesis chapter to my advisor and was feeling pretty good about my progress. I was in the kitchen around 10 p.m. heating up leftover Chinese food when I heard this terrible crash from Jess's room, followed by what sounded like her hitting the floor hard. I ran to her door and knocked. "Jess, you okay in there?" No response. I knocked harder and called her name again, then tried the handle. The door was unlocked, which was unusual. Jess always locked her door when she was changing or sleeping. I found her on the floor next to her desk, unconscious, with her chair overturned beside her. Her face was pale, and there was this thin line of blood trickling from her nose. I've never been good in medical emergencies. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. The paramedics arrived about 8 minutes later. I remember watching the clock on my phone, timing how long it took. They checked her vitals, asked me a bunch of questions about her medical history that I couldn't answer, and decided to take her to Ridgemont General. I followed the ambulance in my car, this ancient Honda Civic that barely starts in cold weather. At the hospital, they wouldn't let me back to see her since I wasn't family, so I spent 4 hours in the waiting room reading the same issue of People magazine over and over. Around 2 a.m., a doctor came out to tell me that Jess was stable and conscious, but they wanted to keep her overnight for observation. He said it looked like she'd had some kind of seizure, but her brain scans came back normal and her blood work was clean. Sometimes these things just happen, he said, in that way doctors have of sounding reassuring and vague at the same time. Stress, lack of sleep, poor nutrition. Graduate school can really take a toll on the body. I wanted to argue that Jess was probably the healthiest person I knew, but I was exhausted and just relieved she was okay. I drove home and collapsed into bed around 3 a.m. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of our front door closing. I checked my phone. It was 9:30 a.m., and I had 3 missed calls from the hospital. I stumbled out to the living room and found Jess setting her keys on the kitchen counter, looking completely fine. Better than fine, actually. Her skin had this healthy glow, and she seemed more energetic than I'd seen her in weeks. "Hey," I said, still groggy. "I was worried sick. The hospital called, but I missed it. Are you feeling okay?" She turned and smiled at me, and that's when I noticed the first weird thing. Jess has always had these warm brown eyes, but in the morning light streaming through our kitchen window, they looked different somehow. Lighter, more reflective. "I feel great," she said. "Better than I have in months, actually. They said it was just exhaustion and sent me home this morning." I wanted to ask more questions, but she seemed genuinely fine, and I had a meeting with my advisor at 11. We talked for a few more minutes about her night at the hospital. She said it was boring, the food was terrible, and she barely slept because of the noise. All normal complaints. The only thing that struck me as odd was a white plastic hospital bracelet she was still wearing. "Don't you want to take that off?" I asked. She looked down at her wrist like she'd forgotten it was there. "Oh yeah, I'll cut it off later." But when I got home that evening, she was still wearing it. The next few days passed normally. Jess went back to her regular routine. Morning runs, lab work, evening study sessions. If anything, she seemed more energetic than usual. She was getting up earlier, staying up later, and I barely heard her moving around the apartment despite our paper-thin walls. When I mentioned this to her, she just laughed and said the hospital scare had motivated her to take better care of herself. But small things started bothering me. Things that didn't quite add up. Like the fact that she was still wearing that hospital bracelet a week later. When I asked about it again, she said the plastic was tougher than she'd expected, and she hadn't found scissors strong enough to cut it. This seemed odd since we had perfectly good kitchen shears in our utensil drawer, but I didn't push it. Then there was the food situation. Jess had always been obsessive about her meal planning, but suddenly she was eating completely differently. I'd come home to find packages of raw ground beef sitting open on the counter, with chunks missing like someone had been eating it with their hands. When I asked her about it, she said she'd been craving more protein and had been making these new energy bowls with barely cooked meat. "Isn't that dangerous?" I asked. "You could get E. coli or something." She shrugged. "I've been doing research on it. Your digestive system adapts faster than people think." This didn't sound like the Jess I knew, the person who used to wash fruit with antibacterial soap and wouldn't eat leftovers that were more than 2 days old. But people change, and graduate school stress affects everyone differently. The thing that really started to worry me happened about 2 weeks after her hospital stay. I was in my room working on a research paper when I heard her talking to someone in the living room. I assumed she was on the phone, but when I came out to get some water, she was alone, sitting on the couch with her laptop closed. "Who were you talking to?" I asked. She looked confused. "I wasn't talking to anyone. I heard voices out here. It sounded like you were having a conversation." "Oh, that." She gestured vaguely at her laptop. "I was just watching a video for one of my classes. Sometimes I talk back to the screen when I'm taking notes." That would have been a reasonable explanation, except her laptop was closed and there were no notebooks or pens around her. When I mentioned this, she said she'd just finished and put everything away. But something about her explanation felt rehearsed, like she'd been preparing for me to ask. Then there was the night I woke up to scratching sounds coming from inside the walls. At first, I thought it might be mice, Our building was old enough that rodent problems wouldn't have surprised me. But the scratching seemed to move in patterns, starting near Jess's room and working its way around the apartment. It went on for about 20 minutes before stopping abruptly. In the morning, I asked Jess if she'd heard anything. "Heard what?" she said, not looking up from her coffee. "Scratching in the walls. It was pretty loud." She shook her head. "I sleep pretty heavily these days. Didn't hear anything." But I'd noticed that Jess barely seemed to sleep anymore. Her light was always on when I went to bed, and it was already on when I got up in the morning. When I asked her about it, she said she'd been having trouble sleeping since the hospital and had been doing more work at night when it was quiet. The scratching sounds became a regular thing, always at night, always starting around 2 a.m., always following the same pattern around the apartment. I started keeping a flashlight next to my bed and checking the walls for signs of animal damage, but I never found anything. No holes, no droppings, no chewed insulation, just those sounds, moving through our walls like something was exploring the space between our rooms. About 3 weeks after Jess came home from the hospital, I started noticing unmarked white vans parked on our street. Not every day, but often enough that I began to recognize them. They looked like medical transport vehicles, the kind you'd see at hospitals or research facilities, but with no logos or license plates I could make out from my window. They'd usually be there in the morning when I left for campus, and gone by the time I got home. I mentioned this to Jess one evening while we were both in the kitchen. She was standing at the stove with her back to me, doing something I couldn't see clearly. "Have you noticed those white vans on our street lately?" I asked. Her hand stopped moving just for a second before she resumed whatever she was doing. "White vans? Yeah, they're here pretty regularly. Kind of weird, right? This isn't exactly a medical district." "I hadn't noticed," she said, but something in her voice sounded careful, like she was choosing her words deliberately. That's when I stepped closer and saw what she was doing at the stove. She had a package of raw chicken breasts opened on the counter, and she was eating pieces of it directly with her hands. Not cooking it, not even seasoning it, just tearing off chunks of raw chicken and chewing them. "Jesus, Jess, what are you doing?" She turned around, and in the overhead kitchen light, I could see that her eyes were definitely different. They had this reflective quality, like light was bouncing off them in a way that wasn't quite human. And there was something smeared around her mouth that looked dark in the artificial light. "I told you, I've been craving more protein," she said, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "This is actually much more nutritious when it's fresh." "That's not fresh, that's raw. You're going to make yourself seriously sick." She smiled, and I noticed that her teeth looked sharper somehow, more pointed. "I feel better than I ever have in my life, Maya. Maybe you should trust that I know what my body needs." I stood there staring at her, trying to process what I was seeing. This was not the roommate I'd known for 2 years. This wasn't even really human behavior. But she was standing there acting like eating raw chicken was the most natural thing in the world. "I'm worried about you," I said finally. "This isn't normal. Maybe you should see a doctor about these changes since the hospital." Her expression shifted, becoming colder. "I saw plenty of doctors at the hospital. They said I was perfectly healthy. But this eating thing, and you never sleep anymore, and your eyes, my eyes." She stepped closer to me, and I caught a smell that made my stomach turn. It was like raw meat mixed with something chemical, something sterile and wrong. "What about my eyes?" I backed toward the kitchen doorway. "They just look different since you came back." She stared at me for a long moment, and in the silence I could hear something that sounded like electricity humming, though we didn't have any major appliances running. Then she smiled again, but it didn't reach those strange, reflective eyes. "Maybe you're the one who needs to see a doctor, Maya. You seem stressed, paranoid." That night, I barely slept. Every sound in the apartment made me jump, and the scratching in the walls seemed louder and more persistent than ever. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room, but they didn't sound right. They were too light, almost like someone was walking on the balls of their feet to avoid making noise. I got up and pressed my ear to my bedroom door. The footsteps stopped directly outside my room and stayed there for what felt like forever. I held my breath listening, and I swear I could hear something else breathing on the other side of the door. Slow, deliberate breaths that didn't match any rhythm I recognized. Finally, the footsteps moved away toward the kitchen. I heard the refrigerator open and close, then more of those careful, too light footsteps going back to Jess's room. Her door closed with the softest click. In the morning, I found 3 more packages of raw meat in our trash can, all opened and partially eaten. When I confronted Jess about it, she said she'd been meal prepping for the week and had thrown away the portions that didn't look fresh enough. "You ate raw hamburger that didn't look fresh enough?" I asked. "I'm being careful about quality," she said, not looking at me. "I only eat the best parts." That's when I noticed something else. Jess was still wearing that hospital bracelet, but now I could see it more clearly. It wasn't a standard patient identification band. Instead of printed information, it had some kind of electronic component embedded in the plastic, and there were tiny lights that blinked in patterns I couldn't decode. "Jess, what kind of hospital bracelet is that?" She looked down at her wrist and quickly pulled her sleeve over it. "Just a monitoring device for my follow-up care." "What kind of follow-up care?" "You said they told you it was just exhaustion." "It's complicated," she said, and walked away before I could ask more questions. That afternoon, I decided to call Ridgemont General myself. I told them I was checking on my roommate's follow-up care and asked about the monitoring bracelet. The nurse I spoke to seemed confused. "We don't use electronic monitoring bracelets for outpatient follow-up," she said. "Standard procedure would be a follow-up appointment with your primary care physician." "Are you sure?" "She's been wearing this device since she was discharged." There was a pause. "What did you say your roommate's name was?" I gave her Jess's full name and the date of her emergency room visit. Another pause, longer this time. "I'm not showing any record of a patient by that name being admitted on that date," the nurse said finally. "That's impossible. I followed the ambulance there myself. I waited in your emergency room for 4 hours. I'm sorry, but I don't have any record of that visit. Are you sure it was Ridgemont General?" I hung up feeling like the ground had shifted under my feet. Either the hospital had lost Jess's records, or something much stranger was going on. I decided to drive over to Ridgemont Medical Associates, the research facility where Jess had worked before. Maybe someone there could explain what kind of monitoring device she was wearing. The receptionist at the medical facility was friendly but unhelpful. She said she couldn't discuss current or former employees without proper authorization, and she'd never seen a monitoring bracelet like the one I described. But as I was leaving, she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "You know, we did have some EMT activity here a few weeks ago," she said casually. "One of the research subjects had some kind of reaction during a trial, but I thought they took him to the university hospital, not Ridgemont General." "Research subjects?" "Oh, yes. We run clinical trials here, mostly pharmacological studies, some experimental treatments, very cutting-edge stuff." I drove home with my head spinning. When I got to our apartment, there was another white van parked across the street, and this time I could see someone sitting in the driver's seat. I couldn't make out details, but they seemed to be watching our building. Inside, Jess was in the kitchen again, and the smell of raw meat was overwhelming. She had packages spread out on every surface: beef, chicken, what looked like lamb or goat. She was systematically opening each package and eating directly from them with her hands. "Jess, this has to stop," I said. "This isn't normal. You're going to make yourself sick, and you're scaring me." She looked up at me, and her eyes were definitely not human anymore. They reflected the kitchen light like an animal's, and the pupils were wrong. Too large, too reactive. When she smiled, I could see that her canine teeth had grown longer and sharper. "I'm not sick, Maya," she said, and her voice sounded different too. Deeper, with an odd resonance that seemed to come from somewhere other than her throat. "I'm better, stronger, more than I was before." "What did they do to you at that medical facility?" Her hand stopped halfway to her mouth, a piece of raw beef dripping between her fingers. "What medical facility?" "The research place where you used to work. They told me they had EMT activity a few weeks ago. A research subject with a reaction." She set down the meat and wiped her hands on a dish towel, staining it red. When she looked at me again, there was something predatory in her expression that made every instinct in my body scream to run. "You've been asking questions," she said. It wasn't really a question. "I'm worried about you. Something is seriously wrong, and I think it started at that research facility, not at the hospital." She stepped closer, and I backed toward the living room. That chemical smell was stronger now, mixed with the metallic scent of raw blood. "You're right," she said, still moving toward me. "Something did happen at the research facility. They were testing something new, something that could enhance human capabilities, make us better adapted to survive." Survive what? Changes that are coming, environmental pressures, resource scarcity. She tilted her head in a way that reminded me of a bird studying prey. The treatment was voluntary. I knew the risks. "Treatment for what?" "For being human," she said, and lunged. I ran. Pure instinct took over, and I bolted for the front door while she was still moving across the kitchen. I heard her behind me, and the sounds she was making weren't human anymore. Some kind of growling mixed with that electrical humming I'd been hearing at night. I made it to my car and locked the doors, hands shaking as I tried to start the engine. Through our kitchen window, I could see Jess standing at the sink, perfectly calm, washing the blood off her hands. She looked out at me and waved like nothing unusual had happened. I drove straight to the police station. The officer who took my statement was patient, but clearly skeptical. When I tried to explain about the raw meat and the changed appearance and the mysterious research facility, I could see him mentally categorizing me as another stressed-out college student having a breakdown. "Has your roommate threatened you directly?" he asked. "Well, not in words, but..." "Has she damaged your property or prevented you from leaving?" "No, but you don't understand. She's not human anymore. Something was done to her." He recommended that I contact the university counseling services and suggested that roommate conflicts were common during stressful periods like graduate school. He said they could do a wellness check if I was truly concerned about Jess's mental health, but everything I'd described sounded like eccentric dietary choices rather than criminal behavior. I stayed at a friend's apartment that night. When I went back the next morning to get some clothes, Jess was gone. All of her belongings were still there, but she wasn't. The white van that had been parked on our street was gone too. She never came back. A week later, I got a text from her number saying she'd withdrawn from the university and moved back home to help with a family emergency. But when I tried calling the number, it was disconnected. The university said they had no forwarding information, and her emergency contacts on file were all disconnected numbers. I tried to investigate the research facility, but when I drove by a few days later, the building was empty. There was a "for lease" sign in the window, and the parking lot was completely cleared out. The receptionist I'd spoken to was gone, along with any trace that medical research had ever been conducted there. That was 6 weeks ago. I moved out of our apartment and found a studio closer to campus. But I still think about Jess every day, and I still check the news obsessively for reports of missing persons or animal attacks in the area. So far, nothing. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. Maybe the stress of graduate school really did make me paranoid and delusional. Maybe Jess was just going through some kind of breakdown and experimenting with extreme dietary changes. Maybe those vans were just coincidences and the research facility relocated for ordinary business reasons. But then I remember the way her eyes reflected light in the dark, and the sound of her breathing outside my bedroom door, and the feeling that something was hunting me in my own apartment. I remember the electronic bracelet she never took off, and the way she moved too quietly, and how she knew things about my research that I'd never discussed with her. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear scratching sounds in the walls of my new apartment. Different walls, different building, but the same deliberate pattern, like something is mapping the space around me. When that happens, I check all my locks twice and sleep with the lights on. I don't think Jess is gone. I think she's out there somewhere, changed into something that was never meant to exist. And I think whatever changed her is still running experiments, still improving their methods, still looking for new test subjects. I think they're getting better at it. That's Maya's story, and honestly, I'm not sure what to make of it. Part of me wants to believe there's a rational explanation, medical emergency, stress-induced hallucinations, maybe even an elaborate hoax. But the details are so specific, so consistent, that it's hard to dismiss entirely. What bothers me most is that last part about the scratching sounds following her to a new apartment. If Maya's story is true, then whatever happened to Jess might not be an isolated incident. It might be part of something bigger, something that's still happening. Stay safe out there, everyone, and if someone you trust starts changing in ways that can't be explained, maybe don't ignore those instincts telling you to run. The estate sale find. I've always been pretty good at reading people. You have to be when you work in marketing. I spend my days at a tech startup in Portland analyzing consumer behavior, figuring out what makes people tick. So when my roommate Maya came back from that weekend estate sale trip, completely different, I noticed immediately. This was back in November of 2019. I remember the exact date she left, Friday, November 8th, because I'd marked it on our shared calendar. Maya worked as a freelance graphic designer, and she'd been obsessing over this estate sale out in Forest Grove for weeks. Some old Victorian house where the entire family had died, she said. The way she talked about it, you'd think she was going to find some priceless antique that would change her life. Maya and I had been roommates for almost 2 years at that point. We shared this converted warehouse apartment in southeast Portland, right off Division Street. The building used to be a textile factory back in the 70s, and our unit still had the original brick walls and those massive industrial windows that let in this amazing light during the day. The rent was steep, $2,400 split between us, but it was worth it for the space and the location. Our relationship was strictly platonic and pretty straightforward. We weren't best friends, but we got along well enough. Maya kept to herself mostly, worked at weird hours depending on her clients, and had this habit of leaving her art supplies scattered around the common areas. I'm more of a neat freak, comes from growing up with my dad, who ran our house like a military operation back in Bend after my mom died when I was 12. Maya's creative chaos used to drive me nuts, but I'd learned to live with it. The morning she left for the estate sale, Maya was practically vibrating with excitement. She'd been up since 5 a.m., which was unusual for her. Normally, she was a solid 9 to 9 sleeper. I found her in the kitchen, downing her third cup of coffee and scrolling through estate sale photos on her laptop. "Look at this place, Jake," she said, turning the screen toward me. The photos showed a dark, cluttered Victorian house with heavy wooden furniture and ornate wallpaper. Everything looked expensive, but somehow unsettling, like it belonged in a museum nobody wanted to visit. The family lived there for 60 years, 3 generations. Can you imagine the stories these pieces could tell? I remember thinking that was a weird way to put it, objects telling stories. But Maya was always saying stuff like that. She had this romantic view of vintage things, like they carried the energy of their previous owners. I just saw old furniture that would probably smell like mothballs. She left around noon, promising to be back Sunday evening. I spent the weekend working on a campaign proposal for a local brewery and catching up on Netflix. It was nice having the place to myself, honestly. I could play my music loud, spread my work across the dining table, and not worry about Maya's unpredictable schedule. Sunday evening came and went with no Maya. She texted around 11 p.m. saying she'd found amazing pieces and would be back late. No big deal. She was an adult, and it wasn't unusual for her to change plans last minute. But when I woke up Monday morning and she still wasn't home, I started to worry. Maya was flaky about a lot of things, but she was always good about communication. I called her twice, both calls going straight to voicemail. By afternoon, I was genuinely concerned. She finally came home Tuesday around 6 p.m., and the second I saw her, I knew something was wrong. Maya looked exhausted. Not just tired, but drained in a way I'd never seen before. Her normally vibrant red hair was stringy and unwashed, hanging around her face like she'd been sleeping in her car. She had dark circles under her eyes that made her look almost skeletal, and her clothes, the same ones she'd worn when she left Friday, were wrinkled and stained with something that looked like dirt. "Hey," I said, looking up from my laptop where I'd been working on the couch. I was starting to get worried. How was the sale? She barely looked at me, just grunted something that might have been fine, and headed straight for her room. I heard her door close, then the sound of her moving furniture around. Heavy scraping noises, like she was dragging her dresser across the floor. I figured she was just tired from the drive and whatever she'd been doing the past few days. Maya could be moody, and I'd learned not to push when she was in one of her withdrawn phases. I made myself dinner and went to bed early, assuming things would be back to normal in the morning. They weren't. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone was being very careful not to make noise. I lay in bed listening, thinking maybe Maya was getting water or going to the bathroom, but the footsteps continued for too long. Back and forth, like she was pacing. Then I heard scraping sounds coming from the living room, furniture being moved. I checked my phone, 3:17 a.m. What the hell was she doing? I got up and cracked my bedroom door open. The hallway was dark, but I could see light coming from under Maya's door and from the living room. The scraping sounds continued, punctuated by what sounded like her muttering to herself. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, almost frantic. I considered going out to check on her, but something held me back. The whole situation felt off in a way I couldn't articulate. Instead, I went back to bed and tried to ignore the sounds, which continued for another hour before finally stopping. The next morning, I expected to find the living room rearranged, or at least disturbed, but everything looked exactly the same. Our couch was still positioned facing the TV, the coffee table in its usual spot, my work materials exactly where I'd left them on the dining table. If Maya had been moving furniture around in there, she'd put everything back exactly as it was. Maya herself was nowhere to be seen. Her bedroom door was closed, and when I knocked to ask if she wanted coffee, there was no response. I assumed she was sleeping off whatever had kept her up half the night. This pattern continued for the rest of the week. During the day, Maya would either be completely absent from the apartment or locked in her room. But every night around 3 a.m., I'd wake up to the sound of her moving around. Footsteps, scraping furniture, and that constant muttering that sounded like she was having a conversation with someone. By Friday, I was getting seriously concerned. Maya looked worse every time I caught a glimpse of her. She'd lost weight, and her skin had taken on this grayish pallor that made her look sick. When I tried to talk to her, she'd respond with single-word answers or just ignore me entirely. "Maya, are you feeling okay?" I asked Thursday morning when I found her standing at the kitchen counter, staring out the window at the parking lot below. She was holding a cup of coffee, but when I looked closer, the cup was empty and bone dry. She turned to look at me, and for a second, I felt this weird chill run down my spine. Her eyes looked different somehow, darker, more distant, like she was looking through me rather than at me. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice sounded flat and mechanical. "Just working on something." "What kind of something?" She didn't answer, just walked back to her room and shut the door. That weekend, I decided to stay up and see what exactly she was doing during her nightly activities. Saturday night, I lay in bed waiting, my phone ready to record whatever was happening. Sure enough, right around 3 a.m., I heard her bedroom door open. I crept to my own door and listened. The footsteps moved down the hallway toward the living room, followed by the now familiar scraping sounds. But this time, I also heard something else, a low humming sound, like she was singing to herself. I eased my door open and peered down the hallway. The living room was dimly lit by what looked like candles, and I could see Maya's silhouette moving around. She appeared to be rearranging furniture, but in a very specific, deliberate way. Each piece was positioned with mathematical precision, like she was following some kind of blueprint. The humming continued, but as I listened more carefully, I realized it wasn't random. There was a pattern to it, a rhythm that seemed almost ritualistic. And underneath the humming, I could hear her whispering. The words were too quiet to make out, but the cadence suggested she was talking to someone. I watched for maybe 10 minutes, trying to understand what she was doing. The furniture arrangements seemed to form geometric patterns, triangles, hexagons, shapes that looked deliberately constructed, and in the center of each arrangement she'd place what looked like small objects. I couldn't see clearly in the candlelight, but they appeared to be decorative items, probably things she'd bought at the estate sale. The whole scene was deeply unsettling. This wasn't just someone having trouble sleeping or dealing with stress. This was deliberate, purposeful behavior that followed rules I couldn't understand. I was about to go back to bed when Maya suddenly stopped moving. She stood perfectly still in the center of the room, and the humming ceased. Then, very slowly, she turned her head toward the hallway, toward me. Even from a distance, I could see her eyes reflecting the candlelight. She was looking directly at my door, and I had the horrible feeling that she knew I was watching. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds. Then she smiled. It wasn't Maya's smile. Maya had this warm, crooked grin that made her whole face light up. This was something else entirely. A wide, unnatural expression that seemed to stretch too far across her face. In the flickering candlelight, it looked almost predatory. I quickly closed my door and retreated to my bed, my heart pounding. I lay there for the rest of the night, listening to her continue whatever she was doing, but I didn't dare look again. The next morning, I found our living room exactly as it always was. No sign of candles, no rearranged furniture, nothing out of place. If I hadn't seen it myself, I would have thought I'd dreamed the whole thing, but I knew I hadn't. And when I passed Maya in the hallway later that day, she gave me that same unsettling smile. I started spending more time away from the apartment. Long hours at the office, drinks with co-workers, anything to avoid being home alone with Maya. When I did have to be there, I kept my bedroom door locked and tried to ignore the nightly sounds from the living room. My friend Marcus, who I'd known since college, started commenting on how stressed I looked. We met for drinks at a bar in the Pearl District one evening in early December, and he wouldn't let it go. "Dude, you look like hell," he said, nursing his beer. "When's the last time you got a full night's sleep?" I wanted to tell him about Maya, but how do you explain something like that? That your roommate has developed some kind of nocturnal ritual involving furniture and candles and conversations with invisible people? It sounded crazy, even to me. "Just work stress," I said. "We're pushing hard on this new campaign." Marcus didn't buy it, but he didn't push. Instead, he suggested I take a weekend trip to the coast, clear my head. I seriously considered it. But before I could make any plans, things escalated. It was a Tuesday night in mid-December when I woke up, not to the usual sounds, but to complete silence. I checked my phone, 3:23 a.m. Maya should have been in the middle of her nightly routine, but the apartment was dead quiet. I lay there waiting, but nothing happened. No footsteps, no scraping, no humming. Just an eerie stillness that somehow felt worse than all the noise. Then I heard my bedroom door handle turn. I'd locked it, like I did every night now, but the handle was definitely moving. Slowly, carefully, like someone was testing whether it would open. My heart started racing as I watched the handle turn back and forth in the dim light from my digital clock. The testing stopped, and I heard footsteps moving away from my door. They headed toward the living room, and then the usual sounds began. Furniture scraping, Maya's humming, the whispered conversations. But now I knew she'd tried to get into my room. Whatever was happening to Maya, I was becoming part of it whether I wanted to or not. The next morning I called in sick to work and spent the day researching the estate sale. I found the listing online, along with some newspaper articles about the family who'd lived in the Forest Grove house. The Hendersons had owned the property for over 60 years. 3 generations had lived there, just like Maya said. But what Maya hadn't mentioned was how they died. The articles were vague, citing a family tragedy that had claimed all 5 residents on the same night. No details about the cause, no mention of illness or accident, just that they'd been found dead in their home by a neighbor who'd come to check on them. I dug deeper and found an obituary that listed the family members, Robert and Eleanor Henderson, their son David, his wife Patricia, and their teenage daughter Sarah. All died on October 15th, 2019. less than a month before Maya's estate sale trip. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. The timing, the mysterious circumstances, Maya's dramatic change in behavior, it all felt connected in a way that made my skin crawl. That night, I decided to confront her. I couldn't keep living like this, wondering what was happening to my roommate and whether I was safe in my own home. I waited until around 10 p.m. when Maya typically emerged from her room to eat something before starting her nightly activities. I found her in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a bowl of cereal she wasn't eating. She was just stirring it absently with a spoon, staring at nothing. "Maya," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and non-threatening, "we need to talk." She looked up at me with those dark, distant eyes. "About what?" "About what you've been doing at night. About how you've changed since you came back from that estate sale. I'm worried about you." For a moment, her expression flickered, and I thought I saw a glimpse of the old Maya. Confused, maybe even frightened. But then it was gone, replaced by that flat, empty stare. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "The furniture moving, the candles, the conversations. Maya, you tried to get into my room last night." Something shifted in her face. The empty expression hardened into something more focused, more alert. "You shouldn't be watching me," she said quietly. "This is my home, too. If you're having some kind of breakdown, I want to help, but I'm not having a breakdown." Her voice was sharp now, with an edge I'd never heard before. "I'm finally understanding. The pieces I brought home, they're teaching me things, important things." "What kind of things?" She smiled, that horrible, too wide smile. "How to prepare, how to make room, how to be a good host." The way she said host made my blood run cold. There was something deeply wrong with the word choice, with the implications behind it. "Maya, I think you should see someone, a doctor or—" "They don't want me to see a doctor," she interrupted. "They want me to finish what I started." "They? Who's they?" But she was already walking away, heading back to her room. At the doorway, she turned back to me. "You really shouldn't watch tonight, Jake. They don't like being watched by people who aren't ready." She closed her door, and I heard the lock click. I should have left then, packed a bag, gone to Marcus's place, figured out what to do in the morning, but I was trapped by a combination of concern for Maya and a morbid curiosity about what was happening in my own home. Instead, I went to my room and tried to think rationally about the situation. Maya was clearly having some kind of psychological break. The stress of her irregular income, the isolation of working alone, maybe even some kind of delayed grief reaction. There were plenty of reasonable explanations for erratic behavior, but deep down, I knew this was beyond anything that simple. At exactly 3 a.m., I heard Maya's door open. This time, I didn't even consider watching. I buried my head under my pillow and tried to block out the sounds from the living room, but tonight was different. The scraping and moving seemed more intense, more urgent, and the humming had changed into something that sounded almost like chanting. Then I heard new sounds, dragging noises like something heavy being pulled across the floor. And underneath it all, Maya's voice, clearer now, speaking in what sounded like complete sentences. But the words were muffled by my pillow and the walls, and I couldn't make them out. The activity continued for hours. At one point, I thought I heard other voices, soft whispers that seemed to respond to Maya's chanting, but that had to be my imagination, influenced by fear and lack of sleep. Around 6 a.m., everything went quiet. I waited another hour before emerging from my room, and when I did, I found the living room in its usual pristine condition. But there was something different now. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand up, and there was a smell, faint but noticeable, like old wood and dust and something else I couldn't identify. Maya's door remained closed all day. When I got home from work that evening, I found a note on the kitchen counter written in her handwriting. "Almost ready. One more night." That was it. No explanation, no context, just those 4 words that filled me with dread. I called Marcus and told him I needed to crash at his place for a few days. I didn't give him details, just said Maya and I were having roommate issues that needed to cool down. He said yes without asking questions, which I appreciated. But as I was packing a bag, I realized I couldn't just leave. Whatever was happening to Maya, abandoning her felt wrong. She was sick or possessed or something, but she was still my friend. I had to try one more time to reach her. I knocked on her bedroom door around 9 p.m. "Maya, I'm worried about you. Can we please talk?" To my surprise, the door opened. Maya stood there in clothes I'd never seen before, a long, dark dress that looked vintage, probably something from the estate sale. Her hair was pulled back severely, and her makeup was different, more dramatic. She looked like she was dressed for some kind of formal event. "You're still here," she said, and there was something like disappointment in her voice. "Maya, what's happening to you? This isn't normal. The things you're doing at night, the way you're acting, this isn't you." She stepped aside and gestured for me to enter her room. Against my better judgment, I did. The space had been completely transformed. Her usual clutter of art supplies and clothes was gone, replaced by carefully arranged antique furniture that must have come from the estate sale. The pieces were beautiful but unsettling. A dark wooden desk with intricate carvings, a tall mirror with an ornate frame, several small decorative boxes arranged with mathematical precision on various surfaces. But what really caught my attention were the walls. Maya had covered them with what looked like architectural drawings or blueprints, geometric patterns that reminded me of the furniture arrangements I'd witnessed, but more complex, more detailed. They looked like plans for something, but I couldn't figure out what. "Do you like it?" Maya asked, noticing my stare. The Hendersons helped me understand the importance of proper arrangement. Everything has to be exactly right for the transition. What transition? She moved to one of the decorative boxes and opened it carefully. Inside was what looked like an old photograph, sepia-toned, showing a family of 5 standing in front of the Victorian house I'd seen in the estate sale listing. "They've been waiting so long," Maya said, touching the photograph gently. "Stuck in that house, unable to move on. But they found a way, through the objects, through the arrangements, through willing hosts." The word hosts again. I felt that same chill run down my spine. "Maya, those people are dead. They died last month. You're talking about them like they're still alive." She looked up at me with pity, like I was a child who didn't understand something obvious. "Death isn't an ending, Jake. It's just a change of location. And sometimes, if you know the right way, you can choose your new location." "You think dead people are talking to you through antique furniture?" "I don't think it. I know it." She closed the box and moved to the mirror. In its reflection, I could see both of us, but Maya's reflection looked different somehow. Older, more formal, like she was wearing different clothes than what I could see with my direct vision. I blinked hard and looked again, but the reflection was normal now. "They'll be coming through tonight," Maya continued. "The arrangements are finally complete. 5 hosts for 5 guests. It's taken weeks to find the right people, but they're all ready now. 5 hosts." "Maya, what are you talking about?" She smiled, that horrible smile again. "The family needs somewhere to stay, Jake, somewhere they can be together again, and we're going to help them." "We?" "You, me, and the others. They've been preparing just like I have. Sarah, she's the daughter. She's been staying with a college student in Beaverton. David, the father, found a young man in Gresham. Patricia, the mother, is with a single woman in Hillsborough, and Robert, the grandfather, he's been working with an elderly man in Lake Oswego." As she spoke, I felt like the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I could see goosebumps rising on my arms. "Maya, you're scaring me. This sounds like what? Like madness?" She laughed, but it didn't sound like her laugh. It was deeper, more resonant, like multiple voices laughing in harmony. I thought the same thing at first, but then I started to understand. The Hendersons aren't gone, Jake. They're just displaced, and tonight they're coming home. I backed toward the door. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get out of the apartment and never come back. But Maya stepped into my path. she said softly. "It's almost time, and Robert has been so looking forward to meeting you. He's very particular about young men, you know. He wants someone strong, someone who can carry on the family traditions." "Maya, stop. This isn't real. Dead people don't possess the living through antique furniture." "Don't they?" She tilted her head, studying me like I was an interesting specimen. "How would you know? Have you ever tried? Have you ever opened yourself to the possibility that consciousness can exist beyond the physical body?" I had to get out. I pushed past her toward the door, but she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. Her fingers felt ice cold, even through my shirt. "Jake, don't fight this. They've chosen you specifically. Robert has been watching you for weeks, learning about you, preparing for the merger. It's an honor." I jerked my arm free and ran for the front door, but Maya was right behind me. As I fumbled with the locks, I heard her whisper something in a language I didn't recognize. The words seemed to echo in the hallway, growing louder and more insistent. Then the lights went out. The apartment was plunged into complete darkness, but I could hear Maya moving around me, her footsteps circling like a predator, and I could hear other sounds too, footsteps that didn't match hers. Whispers in multiple voices, the scraping of furniture being moved in the living room. "They're here," Maya said from somewhere in the darkness. "The family is finally home." I found the door handle and yanked it open, stumbling out into the hallway. The building's emergency lighting cast everything in a sickly green glow, and I could hear sounds coming from other apartments, voices, movement, the same kind of scraping and rearranging I'd been hearing from Maya. 5 hosts, she'd said. 5 apartments, 5 roommates, 5 people like me who'd been chosen to accommodate the Henderson family. I ran for the stairs, taking them 3 at a time, and burst out onto the street. The November air was cold and wet, but it felt like freedom after the suffocating atmosphere of the apartment. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, and I didn't stop driving until I was at Marcus's place in Northwest Portland. I never went back to the apartment. I had Marcus help me get my essential belongings while Maya was out, if she was still Maya at all. We found the living room arranged in that geometric pattern I'd seen before, with 5 chairs positioned around a central table. On the table were 5 antique photographs of the Henderson family members. Marcus thought I'd had some kind of nervous breakdown. He suggested therapy, medication, a vacation somewhere warm. He didn't believe my story about possession and dead families, and I don't blame him. It sounds insane. But 3 months later, I saw a news article about a missing persons case in Lake Oswego. An elderly man named Richard Torres had disappeared from his home, leaving behind a confused family and no explanation. The only unusual detail was that his apartment had been found filled with antique furniture that neighbors swore hadn't been there the week before. I checked the other areas Maya had mentioned. Missing persons reports from Beaverton, Gresham, Hillsborough, all young people, all disappeared without a trace, all leaving behind unexplained collections of vintage furniture. Maya herself was never reported missing because she had no close family and few friends outside of her client network, but her landlord eventually evicted her for non-payment of rent, and when they cleaned out the apartment, they found it completely empty except for 5 antique chairs arranged around a table. I live in Seattle now, different city, different job, different life, but sometimes when I'm browsing estate sales or antique shops, I catch myself looking for Victorian furniture, for pieces that might have belonged to families with dark histories, and when I find them, I walk away. Because I know now that some objects carry more than just stories. Some carry the people who owned them, waiting patiently for the right opportunity to come home. And they're very, very good at finding suitable hosts. So there you have it. 3 stories about the people we trust enough to share our most vulnerable moments with. The ones who see us first thing in the morning, who know which leftovers are ours, who we rely on to split the electric bill and remember to lock the door at night. But here's what we learned tonight. When you live with someone, you become an expert in their ordinary. You know the sound of their footsteps on the stairs, the way they clear their throat before speaking, how long they spend in the bathroom every morning. So when ordinary becomes extraordinary overnight, well, that's when you have to ask yourself whether the person sleeping 10 feet away from you is still the same person you agreed to live with. Sweet dreams, everyone. And remember, if your roommate starts acting strange, maybe don't dismiss it as a phase. Sometimes the biggest red flag isn't what someone does. It's how perfectly they remember to act like themselves while doing it. Until next time, keep your doors locked, even the ones inside your own home.